This video was brought to you by Nebula. After the coup in Niger earlier this month, protesters in the capital Niamey chanted "Down with France" and waved Russian flags. Later, a crowd attacked the French embassy, forcing a hurried and slightly embarrassing evacuation by French officials. This isn't the first time we've seen this sort of thing either. Last year, after the coup in Mali, protesters carried flags with "Death to France and its allies" and praising cooperation between Russia, China and Mali. Now, it's generally not a great idea to infer too much from a couple of flags, but it's nonetheless clear that France's influence and popularity in Africa, especially in its former colonies, is waning. So, in this video, we're going to take a look at how French-African relations have developed since the end of colonialism, why Africa and France have fallen out, and what might happen next. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. Now, when you hear the question, why is France unpopular in Africa, the answer that first comes to mind is colonialism. Without going into too much detail, much of Africa, especially West Africa, was colonised by France in the 18th and 19th centuries. Other European countries, including Britain, Belgium and Portugal, also had colonies in Africa, but France today has more influence in its former colonies than its peers. For instance, France is the only of these countries to still have military bases in its former colonies. And in the past, the French military has been conspicuously willing to intervene on behalf of friendly governments in the region. Since independence in the 60s, France has intervened militarily in Africa more than 50 times, according to a report by the French Parliament. France was especially keen on intervention during the Cold War, largely because France's apparent responsibility to defend Africa from communism dovetailed with its interest in maintaining regional hegemony against Soviet influence. While France closed down some of its military bases and reduced its troop presence in Africa after the Cold War, its close ties with African elites and military footprint means that France was still the go-to security guarantor for many African governments. As well as political and military influence, France also has economic influence in its former colonies. The most obvious manifestation of this is the CFA franc, which many of these countries use as their national currency. For context, the CFA franc refers to two currencies, the West African CFA franc and the Central African CFA franc, which are both pegged to the euro and require member states to deposit half of their reserves with the French treasury. While the pros and cons of this currency are disputed, some people see it as a form of financial neo-colonialism, and it's been a point of contention in West African politics for years. But while colonialism obviously plays a role, France's acute unpopularity in Africa is actually a relatively recent phenomenon. As recently as the early 2010s, France was pretty popular, or at least more popular than it currently is in the continent. In 2013, for example, after France deployed thousands of troops in Mali as part of an anti-jihadist operation at the invitation of the Malayan government, then President François Hollande was met with cheering crowds when he visited the capital, Bamako. As the most foreign policy-oriented president since at least Chirac, Macron has invested a lot of political capital into Africa. In his first term, Macron promised a reset of French-African relations, which included returning works of art from museums in Paris to Benin and Senegal, committing to abolishing the CFA franc and putting an end to what's sometimes dubbed Francafrique, which refers to the dodgy post-colonial web of secretive political and business connections between French and African elites. However, as recent events have demonstrated, Macron's efforts have clearly been unsuccessful, and France's reputation and influence in Africa has declined in recent years. As we see it, there are three reasons for this. The first is the fact that the French military has been unable to dislodge the jihadists terrorizing the Sahel. Despite both the UN and France deploying thousands of troops to the region as part of Operation Barkhane, which ended in November of last year, the number of jihadist-related attacks is still rising, and political instability is spreading throughout this region of Africa. The generals staging military coups in Africa often justify them by claiming that their countries need military governments to defend against the threat of jihadism, and some of these new military governments have ditched the French army in favour of less conventional security services. In Mali, for example, the new military government has hired the Wagner Group to replace the void left by French forces. The second reason is that the economic ties between Africa and France have weakened, which means African leaders are under less pressure to maintain friendly relations with the French. France's share of African trade has declined from 7% to about 2%, with an especially steep decline in its former colonies. Here, France has been essentially replaced by other so-called middle powers vying for influence and trade on the continent. Emerging powers such as India, Russia, Brazil and Turkey have all scaled up their diplomatic and economic presence in Africa, but the big story here is China. Having accounted for less than 1% of Africa's trade in the early 90s, China now accounts for an astonishing 17% of all African trade, with Chinese firms essentially providing cheap components and manufacturing in exchange for natural resources. So you get the point. Africa is less economically dependent on France than it once was, and in many ways, France is now more dependent on Africa, given that it imports a significant fraction of both its oil and uranium from Africa. The third reason France's unpopularity in Africa is waning is the fact that France, and to be fair, the West more generally, just hasn't done enough to counter the information war that's being waged against it in Africa by countries like Russia and China, who try to paint the West as hypocritical and incompetent neo-colonialists. This can land well with a new generation of African politicians, who are generally more anti-colonial than their predecessors and more open to new alliances. Simply put, France and the West just haven't done enough to push back against these narratives. Take the war in Ukraine, for example. The West has been unable to convince African countries that Putin's invasion of Ukraine has been terrible for African food and energy security, which is why African countries are generally ambivalent on the issue, and many have expressed sympathy with Russia's anti-NATO narratives. All these reasons have been exacerbated by the history and memories of colonialism, which makes France the perfect scapegoat. When France deploys troops or invests in Africa, they're accused of neo-colonialism. But when Russia sends troops into Mali, it's Russia protecting Malayans. Or when China invests in Niger, it's China supporting African business. So that's why France and Africa have fallen out. Whether this trend will continue is anyone's guess. So subscribe to stay up to date. Also, this isn't the only tension in the region, with many talking about the potential of war breaking out in the Sahel region. In fact, we just released an episode of our show, The Daily Discussion, where we broke down the very latest from the conflict and why it's likely to escalate further. The TLDR writing team hosts these daily discussions most days, diving deeper into a news story we write about, and unpacking the hidden details that they found fascinating, but that were either too long or too academic to make it into the final script. If you want to check this series out, you can find the episodes exclusively on Nebula. The best news is that Nebula is less than £2 a month and provides you with ad-free and exclusive videos from TLDR and a ton of incredible content from other creators like Johnny Harris, Real Life Law and Legal Eagle. Check it out by clicking the link in the description and make sure you use our link so they know that you came from us.